I was fascinated by this little company called Facebook, back in 2005, 2006. You have that mental model of your back is against the wall and you've got to really fight for your survival all the time. Companies die all the time because of not having that. I think all of the hype is probably not enough still around AI. I think AI will so dramatically change our world that in 20 years it will not be recognizable from what it is today.
In this episode of Conductive Conversations, Carrie Lai speaks with five-time entrepreneur Kevin Chou. Kevin shares his journey that began with his fascination with Facebook in the early 2000s to founding Kabam and the many turns along the way. They discuss the importance of resilience in entrepreneurship, transitioning from VC to founder-operator, and the future impact of AI. Kevin also touches on leadership lessons, balancing his passion and opportunity, and his little-known detour into playing professional poker. We hope you enjoy this episode.
I'd like to welcome everyone to another episode of Conductive Conversations. I'm really excited to speak with our guest today, Kevin Chou. Not only is he an advisor to Conductive Ventures, but he is also a five-time founder. And as an overachiever, founding one company just wasn't enough. Kevin is a dear, dear friend of mine. We met while we were studying abroad in Hong Kong, became great friends, and even became roommates while we were doing investment banking together as young analysts in San Francisco right out of school. He's a UC Berkeley alum, or as many people call it, Cal. For any of our listeners, if you ever go to Haas Business School and walk into the Connie and Kevin Chou Hall, this is the Kevin Chou that made an incredibly generous donation to Cal. Now, Kevin, clearly your list of accomplishments and accolades could fill the entirety of our show, but what I really want to get down to and focus on is why you decided to seemingly take a career detour and play professional poker, because that is not on your LinkedIn profile. I'm just kidding. The poker part is true, but we'll circle back to that a little bit later. I think what would be really instructive for our listeners is I don't think you have a typical path to entrepreneurship. Let me explain. You go to Cal, you do investment banking, then you work for a short time at a data analytics company, then you work into venture capital. And at that moment in time, most people would say, okay, I'm gonna probably stay in venture capital, probably become, a fat VC.
Like you did.
Yeah, like I did.
Okay.
But you do something interesting. You decide to found a company. You become an operator. And I don't think there are too many VCs out there who decide to leave their cushy jobs and then become an operator. The inverse of it is certainly true. There are lots of operators that probably get sick of operating and become VCs, but not too many people that I know of go the other way around. So my first question is, why did you decide to leave your cushy VC job and start a company in your early 20s? What was your motivation?
I don't know if I've talked about this before, but the honest answer is that I actually really liked VC. And I thought, it was becoming clear to me after 2 years of being a venture capitalist that the best VCs had something very special to offer to the entrepreneurs. We can fast forward 20 years to 2025, and we know that being a VC, you have to make sure you get to the right entrepreneurs with the right marketing and messaging and so forth to win the deal. But even in 2004 or 5, when we were associates at our firms, it was clear that the best CEOs wanted to work with a VC, and specifically the partner that could help them build that business. And I realized after a couple of years of being a VC that my background as an investment banker was not the thing that was going to help a CEO be successful. A CEO could go to Goldman Sachs or Morgan and get that advice, and that wasn't something that they were looking for from their investor. What they wanted was real strategic advice in that board meeting when they were facing a hard decision. do I let go of this executive? Do I take this deal? Do I go into this business line or not? And I realized that I didn't have the experience to help the CEOs make those types of decisions. And so I thought that the best way for me to be that partner to a great CEO was to go off and start my own company. That wasn't 100% of the reason, of course, but it was a big part of the reason that I said, I could see myself hitting a ceiling in the venture industry. And for me to really be a great VC, if I ever want to continue down this path, I need to be on the other side of the table. That's what I thought at that point in time. The second thing, of course, was that it was 2006, and it was a great time to be in technology. From the outside, it looked like not much was happening yet because we were still coming off of the dot-com crash. Things were still, it was not cool to be an entrepreneur. It was not cool to be doing a startup in 2006. And there was no angel funding and so forth. The market wasn't nearly as developed as it is now.
The show Silicon Valley hadn't
exactly.
glorified entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. But being here and what was happening at that time was there was TechCrunch was just getting started. There was this thing called Lunch 2.0. And it was a thing that Michael Arrington put on that brought entrepreneurs and people interested in entrepreneurship together. And it was just clear that the Facebooks were getting built at that time. LinkedIn was getting built at that time. There was no iPhone yet, so there was no mobile devices yet. But it was just clear that there was a new resurgence in tech. And the dot-com crash was kind of far enough in the rearview mirror, and that there was this new wave of being able to build dynamic software that was kind of a precursor to what we're now seeing in the Facebooks and Metas and AI systems that the ChatGPTs that are really taking over and becoming so everyday life for us. That was just starting in 2006.
So do you feel like in order to be a good board member, and you've had experiences with lots of different boards, different constructions of different board members, investor board members, operator board members, do you feel like some of the best board members you've had historically have all had entrepreneurship, company operating experience?
Yes and no. So I do think at the early stages, the early stage board members and VCs, it is important to be an operator. I think the best early stage VCs have that experience and can help a CEO get through the first few stages of running a company. I do think IVP is a great firm that generally comes in later. And so there's a set of investors that come in later when the company is starting to think about, do I do an IPO? Do I expand internationally? Do I, how do I set up my debt facilities and bring in a world-class CFO? Those are the things that the later stage investors don't need to have that operating experience, but can look at it from an investor and capital market standpoint. That I think is really helpful as well. So it just really depends on the stage of the company and what board members add the most value at that stage.
I want to circle back to that a little bit later, but when I think about how you founded Kabam, similar to a lot of founders, you made a series of pivots before becoming a gaming company. Can you talk about the early beginnings of Water Cooler, which again doesn't show up on your LinkedIn profile, and the original concept? What happened?
When we first started, what was Kabam? It was Water Cooler, as you mentioned. And it started because I was fascinated by this little company called Facebook, back in 2005, 2006. And I tried to get my firm to compete for the Series A. And we just weren't competitive for the Series A because I think our firm didn't really understand what was happening in what was happening on internet technologies back then. And I was fascinated by Facebook. I thought their growth was just incredible, and that wasn't really widely discussed at that time. By the way, this is pre-Twitter, so getting your news and information really happened through the Water Cooler back then. And so I wanted to start a social network that was like Facebook, but instead of, and back then, remember, Facebook was only available to college students.
Right.
And so I thought, why don't I start a Facebook for people who were like me, who had graduated from college, but were still looking for that social connectivity, especially with the friends who maybe moved to a different city and so forth. So
Friendster was Friendster around?
Friendster was actually even before this. So Friendster was part of the original .com sort of casualties, and then Facebook was sort of Friendster V2. And so this was, Facebook was taking off, LinkedIn was taking off, but again, LinkedIn in 2006 was just a resume posting site.
Yeah.
There was not the interactivity that was in the Facebook feed for Facebook. So the idea behind Water Cooler was to target young professionals who had just graduated, generally living in a big city, and create that social network for people who are looking for that connectivity with maybe their college friends, trying to build new friends in a new city. And so that was what Water Cooler was meant to be. But by the time we started, built, and launched our product, Facebook had opened up to everyone, and then they were off to the races. And we knew we had to pivot at that point.
So tell me about that first pivot.
Well, the very first pivot was building applications on Facebook.
Okay.
And so Facebook was just moving so fast those days. They were both growing incredibly fast from a user standpoint, but the thing to note about Facebook in the early days was they would be shipping and releasing new products every week. It was incredible. And it wasn't just new features, it was big, huge new initiatives. So one of the early initiatives was something called Facebook Canvas, which was kind of a way to build mini applications inside of Facebook. And so that was relatively new back then in terms of internet. You wouldn't expect to go to a website where that website was being served by two different companies, but that's what Facebook pioneered. And so we thought, let's build some apps inside of Facebook. And so we had originally focused on sports apps inside of Facebook because people using Water Cooler were basically just talking about sports. And so we said, all right, let's go build some sports apps on Facebook. And that did okay. So we raised a Series A based off of that. We grew from 0 to 1 million users, I remember, in about 30 days. And with that type of growth, and Facebook was so hot back then, and everyone thought, hey, this is, VCs were interested in investing in the app ecosystem back then. Yeah. This is kind of a precursor to the iPhone app ecosystem.
So then tell me about the Series B. So you talked about Series A.
So the Series A happened in about 1 week, which is one of the fastest fundraisers I ever did. The Series B was the opposite end of the spectrum. So what happened was I had a great Series B signed, actually, in 2008. And we had signed the deal. It was a great up round in terms of the valuation. We had the long form done and everything. We were basically just waiting on the wires. And this was, I can't remember the exact time in 2008, but basically what happened was Bear Stearns failed. This is right as the 2008.
I think this was September, October of 2008. Yeah.
So Bear Stearns had failed. And then we went into the weekend, and that was what the news were running the entire weekend. And then we came back on Monday, and then Lehman Brothers failed, the next week. And so I thought to myself, having been on Wall Street and interviewing for several of these banks, I said, "Oh, this is insane. I actually thought to myself, I remember thinking, there's just no way that my deal gets done."
Oh, you already had an inkling?
I already had an inkling. Yeah, because I've been on the investment banking side, I've been on the VC side. When that type of trauma comes into a market, just everything changes. Oh. And so maybe if it was with a bigger, more reputable firm, that really stood by their deals, maybe we would have got the deal done, but it was with a small firm back then, which is no longer around. I won't say the name.
Well, they're no longer around.
They're no longer around. So that deal falls apart. They basically call me up a month later and say, Kevin, we can't do this deal anymore. And I spent the next 9 months fundraising. I remember I had a spreadsheet. Back then there was no Google Docs, but I had a spreadsheet that had every single firm I pitched. And I had 90 firms that I had pitched for my Series B over the next 9 months.
Wow.
And we basically did everything we could to cut costs during those 9 months. Our revenues also plummeted during that time because our business was 100% dependent on advertising.
Yep.
Back then, so we were running these sports communities on Facebook.
No one's advertising with the economy.
our CPMs drop way down, and our revenues we lost 80% of our revenues in 9 months.
Wow.
So even though we had still great user growth and engagement, we lost 80% of our revenue back then. And eventually I did a flat round with a betting company that wanted to come in and do sports betting. That was interested not in sports betting, but sort of social applications on Facebook. And they thought that was their way to grow their business. And so because we were doing these sports communities, there might be a partnership with them. And so somehow I got that deal over the finish line. And it took me 9 months of fundraising every single week to get that deal done.
How did those investors do on multiple of capital?
Well, yeah, the funny thing is, I think those investors made about 40x, on that. The Series B and Series A was about a 40x.
So quick question for you. How do you, if you were looking back today, and let's say that firm did fund you at that moment in time, and you didn't have those 9 months to cut costs and do all the things, how do you think your journey would have dramatically changed?
I actually think we might have died. I actually think because that first deal was so good.
It's too easy.
It was too easy. It was a much bigger check than what we ended up raising. So we ended up raising a $5 million Series B. I think the deal from the first VC was, a $10 million check on a valuation that was 2.5 times higher.
Yeah.
I wonder if we had raised that money, being a first-time entrepreneur back then, I probably wouldn't have cut costs. I don't know if I would have pivoted the company again, because we would have raised $10 million, which 20 years ago was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard to establish the counterfactual back then, but
of course,
we might have kept charging, burning money, and been doing okay. And so maybe we wouldn't have pivoted at the end of the day.
So you actually have to thank this firm for pulling their term sheet and not funding you for this successful future that you ended up having.
One of the things that I do love about the Conductive model, right, even for your companies that raise a lot of money, is this emphasis on markets change, market conditions change all the time, new competitors emerge, new technology trends emerge, and that unless you're hungry and really thinking hard about having your almost kind of creating ways that you have that mental model of your back is against the wall and you've got to really fight for your survival all the time. Companies die all the time because of not having that. And the reality is, you talked about several of the other companies that I founded. I do think that in some subsequent chapters, based on having a ton of experience, I was able to raise too much money and probably didn't adapt to changing market conditions as fast, in some of my subsequent companies, even though I had all of this experience doing it for the first time. I thought, this market's a little bit different. We have enough money to weather the storm. So I do think it's hard to think about the what if scenarios, but I do think having that mentality that things can change anytime, we have to be always on guard and really thinking about a market environment and a business environment that changes all the time. I think that's really healthy for a CEO.
I think every first-time founder will inevitably often become a second-time and maybe a third-time founder. In your journey now being a 5-time founder, you kind of alluded to it should have been easier per se, because you had all this experience, knowledge. When you look back on the companies that you've helped to found and co-found, what do you think is like the most profound lesson that you've learned in terms of the success that you created at Kabam versus all the other companies that are obviously still alive and going?
Yeah, I think probably the deepest learning I've had to learn over and over again is that product market fit is really, really hard. And there's different stages of product market fit. We generally talk about product market fit as it's sort of binary. You either have it or you don't. But in reality, there's a few different stages of product market fit. And so there's like early product market fit. And I think a lot of times you can get to early product market fit with enough capital, with enough experience and relationships that you can get to your first several millions of dollars of revenue.
Yep.
And it's hard and it's not guaranteed, but you can get there. But it doesn't actually guarantee you kind of this longer product market fit. And I think actually even here in 2025, market cycles and conditions change even more rapidly. So even if you have an amazing product market fit, things are just changing faster and faster. And that I think every business needs to constantly think, how do I find the next level of product market fit? How do I find that next stage of growth? And it's generally doing things it's re-examining some assumption. It's re-examining or rebuilding a part of the business to be stronger in that next cycle. And I do think that process needs to happen all of the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've learned over starting companies over 5 times at this point.
So obviously one of the key things you have to do when you're founding a company is you gotta go hire a bunch of people, right? Because obviously you can't do it all. So when you build and lead your teams, what do you look for in the people that you work with?
It differs by function. I've generally built software companies. So one of the first people that I look for is somebody who could head up software development. For somebody who's going to head up software development, this is actually something that's changed quite a bit. I think in the early days of software development, I was looking for somebody that could be a full stack CTO. Mm-hmm. And I think in 2025, it's really important to find a CTO that I think will be incredibly adaptable for how market conditions are going to change. And I'll be honest, I think 2025, if I were starting a company right now, this is probably the hardest time to start a new software company. I think unless you are embracing, number one, you should be creating an AI-driven product for sure. But second is really thinking about embracing how AI will change the entire software development process over the next 5 years. Mm-hmm. It will dramatically change. And I think it requires finding a team that's going to embrace change first and foremost, on the development side. I think the next area that I look for is generally somebody on the sales or marketing side, right? And I think that type of a leader, while of course embracing change is important, the reality is for that type of leader, you want somebody who's got an incredible amount of experience, a reputation, and relationships that they can rely on, that they can bring into the company that's direct and relevant to that industry. So I think that type of person is really, more about somebody who you can have an honest conversation with about what's going well and what's not going well in terms of the sales and marketing side. And making sure that there's just a lot of trust that is developed as you try to find product market fit for the business. And then I think inevitably, I generally try to bring in somebody who can be a great project manager. So head of operations, essentially, keep all the trains running on time. And so I think between the sales or marketing side of the business, the product development side of the business, then the third part is just making sure that everything from the legal, finance, and the things that need to be taken care of there to what's happening on the revenue, with the customer-facing side to what's happening on the product side, all of that is being run at a very quick tempo. And so I think generally that's the way I try to build a business in the early days right now, is find a good functional leadership in each of those areas, those 3 areas.
In Silicon Valley, people often talk about pursuing your passion. Right? It's not very first-gen immigrant when you say pursuing one's passion.
Yes.
I'm curious, what role did passion play when you founded Water Cooler, obviously then becoming Kabam? And do you think that every entrepreneur needs to have that type of passion in order to be successful?
I think that passion can come from a few different areas. So I do agree with the idea that you need to be passionate about running the company, about starting a company. Do you need to be, when we first started, were we passionate about social networks? Yes, but it was sort of it was something that we the founding team came together and learned about just in a year prior to us starting the company. So were we could we say that was our lifelong passion to start a social networking company? No, because social networking didn't even exist.
Right.
5 years before that. And I think that some people could say, well, you eventually build a video game company and you're passionate. You know me, I've always loved playing video games my entire life. And I do think that was helpful. But I think if I would really be honest, I was really passionate about starting a company. I love the idea of building a team, building a product, for the first time. I'd never started a company before. And so the whole process of starting a company, everything from figuring out how to incorporate the company, how do I set up payroll, how do I hire and give somebody an offer letter for the first time, to how do I run a performance review, all of that was new to me, and I loved every aspect of that. So I think I was really passionate about the learning process of going through and learning how to build something from the ground up.
From scratch.
Something that didn't exist before, and kind of build it up from scratch. And I was really passionate about that.
If I could just double click on that. So I'm curious, what do you think was the hardest part of transitioning from an employee, which you were at the venture fund, when we were banking, investment banking analyst, you were an employee. What was the hardest part of transitioning from an employee to a founder and CEO? And I'm curious, maybe as akin to that, what do you think most people often mistakenly assume when you're the CEO?
That's a great question. I think the biggest learning is that somebody has to come up with the rules. So, I've learned this now from having 3 little kids, but there's this feeling that, somebody's making the rules out there. And somebody's dictating, you sort of come into this world and everything around you just seems so formed. And you just kind of don't question that. Why do the traffic laws exist? Why do organizations run a certain way? How does revenue, come in the door? And I think when you build a company from scratch, nothing exists. And so until the founders set how something should work, there's nothing there. And so one can come in and say, well, okay, we started investment banking, or we did a VC firm, and we could sort of bring in kind of how we did things at our last companies. But of course, bringing in how we did things at a VC firm wouldn't be that helpful for building a software company.
100%.
Right? And so I had to really think, what is even the cadence that we talk to each other? When do we agree that we're going to go do something and actually do it? And so all of the sort of things that happen in the company, we basically built, rebuilt, and rebuilt again over time. And so it was this idea that everything from the communications to when something would be delivered to when do we talk about what happened and what do we do about it? Do we ever change any of our assumptions, that we had when we first, started building this product? All of those things were built from the ground up. And so I think that is the hardest thing for a first-time CEO to figure out is, how do I take this life that I've had in the past and how I've perceived things to be done to I'm the one that is now, especially for a new start. This is especially for a new start, not if you're coming in as a CEO,
right.
For an
you're in charge
startup. It's like, not only are you in charge, but you have to build everything from the ground up.
Yep.
And until somebody says that this is important and this needs to be done by this time, and here's how much money we have to do this thing, and who's going to go do it, that thing doesn't get done.
So what do you think first-time CEOs get wrong the most?
I think they get wrong that they don't dictate enough of these things, or they don't. There's been this debate about founder mode versus whatever the other side of it is, right? And I'm very much, I very much come out on the founder mode side. Unless you're in the details and sort of saying, we're going to go do this by this time, and how are you doing it? And it's really a company can get off track very quickly.
And do you feel like a lot of CEOs just don't step up and say, hey, this is the way we're going to do it?
That's right.
Because most people often avoid conflict.
That's right.
Okay.
The hardest thing about a first-time CEO is that unless you're incredibly senior and you've literally done all the different jobs in the company before, which almost nobody has that career.
Of course.
You don't know how to manage, you don't even know how to hire or manage people who are, for example, a software engineer or a product manager or a marketer or a salesperson or somebody who's running legal.
Or what a world-class person should look like in that role.
But even for, like, that's a separate question. But even just you're hiring somebody in the early days, right? So if you're a more scrappy startup and you don't have the budget to go hire somebody world-class, but you can hire somebody capable to do that job. And let's assume you've got somebody with some relevant experience and they're capable of doing the job.
Yeah.
It's still hard as a first-time CEO to even figure out what is this person's KPIs? What should this person be doing every day? What should they deliver? When should they deliver it? What quality should that delivery be? How should that function interact with all the other functions that are in the company? Like, all of those things need to get figured out. So one of the most disruptive things when a company is growing is they add a new function. So the first time you bring somebody in that does sales, right? The way that salesperson is working with your product team and your engineering team, that needs to get figured out. Right? Before it was maybe probably the CEO selling.
That's right.
And then, the CEO's interacting with all these other people. And now you have the CEO sitting on top, that salesperson, that product manager, and that engineering team trying to figure out how to work together. It's very different. And so, those are the things that I think, unless a CEO is actively thinking, I don't understand, I've never done this thing before, but I'm going to hire this person and I'm going to get into the details enough. And the first thing I recommend is get into the details, because that's how you learn. If you don't get into the details, you can't learn what's going on, right? And the second thing is, as you get more and more comfortable with understanding how that function should work, then the CEO always needs to, whenever you have an opinion, even if you're not sure of your opinion, you should find a way to figure out if your opinion is correct or incorrect. And then over time, you get confident enough to say, you know what? Even though I've never done this function before, I have an opinion about how this function should run and interface with other parts of the company. And I'm going to make sure that the way I want it run is how it gets run.
So I'm curious, as a first-time CEO, do you ever suffer from imposter syndrome?
Of course.
Because like you said, you are now managing senior functional folks who could do circles around you in finance and sales and marketing. And so when you experienced imposter syndrome, how'd you overcome it?
To a certain extent, I don't think whenever stops feeling a level of
you
imposter
still have
syndrome.
imposter syndrome?
Absolutely.
Really?
Oh, absolutely.
5-time founder Kevin Chou, with your name on a building at Berkeley, still have imposter syndrome.
Absolutely.
Wow.
I do think I've tried. You talk about my career, and it's been a not normal career. So even in the entrepreneurship side, I haven't just kept starting video game company after video game company. Right? That would be the easier thing to do in some ways, and maybe I wouldn't feel as much imposter syndrome if I just did that and stayed in the same industry. But in some ways, I feel like I learn the most and I grow the most when I try doing something new. And the other thing is, I've generally gravitated, much like how I started Water Cooler and then we transitioned into Kabam and we built the first mobile phone games. I've always been attracted to what's on the edge, what's on the frontier, what's new. And so, I spent my last 7 years building crypto companies, and crypto companies were new.
Right.
And it wasn't clear what was going to happen with the industry. And, but that type of risk, I think also, if I look at it from a business strategy standpoint, it is really important to actually go towards the frontier. And so, if you were building an AI company in 2023, you're probably doing pretty good. Versus, I think if you're getting started building a new AI company in 2025, now it's more competitive to figure out where the white spaces are, right?
Yep.
And so it's just much easier as an entrepreneur. It's one of the first advices I give to new entrepreneurs or people thinking about starting an idea is go towards the frontier. And it's not that hard to figure out what a frontier is. You just sit down with some VCs and some other people, and if somebody has said, hey, I've seen 10 pitches like yours before, you're not at the frontier, right?
Yep.
If you're going to be at the frontier, you're going to have a story and a narrative that somebody who's been in your position, Carrie, is going to say, I might not invest in that because I might not be what I do or what our business model would be.
Yeah.
But at least I've never heard that pitch before, right?
No.
And that's where I've always wanted to be with my career. It's where I feel like I do my best learning. And it's just there's something innately about me that attracts me to those things. And I think that's part of, I think, what makes me, want to be a lifelong entrepreneur is I'm attracted to the frontier.
Kevin, what is your superpower? What makes you, as you've looked back on your journey so far, founding 5 companies, what is so unique about Kevin Chou that has literally become your superpower?
I think I learn very fast, and I think I've always been learned quickly, and I don't get too wrapped up in sunk costs. So meaning that I'm willing to adapt and change and evolve very quickly. That it's why when we talked about the history of water cooler evolving to Kabam, it actually went through multiple evolutions. Every time we went through that evolution, I think we did it quickly and we fully committed to the new direction. And I think that was because we learned and we very quickly said, all the things that we thought were true 6 months ago, 12 months ago, we've learned that they're not true. And instead of clinging to that somehow, let's fully embrace this new reality that we're in. And I think it's what makes me a really poor employee at a big company is that I don't want to just do the thing that's been done for the last 5 years and just iterate on it again for the next year or 2 years. And it's what makes me, I think, want to be an entrepreneur, where I love what's new, what's possible, and let's not get too wrapped up in how we've done anything before. Let's go figure out this new thing. And I think it's certainly, I think, my superpower. I don't think it's necessary for every entrepreneur to have this, but I do think that ingredient is very helpful for entrepreneurs in general.
All right, I'm going to give you a brain break, and we're going to shift gears a little bit. This is what I call the fun question part of it, okay? I don't want you to think.
Okay.
I want you to instinctively answer the next 10 or so questions. First thing that comes to your mind. Okay? They're supposed to be fun. It starts off very simply and hopefully gets more interesting over time. Okay?
Okay.
What's your favorite color?
Red.
What's your favorite fruit?
Strawberries.
Favorite animal?
Pandas.
Favorite sport?
Tennis.
Do you like spam?
No.
What is your password to your bank account?
Carrie is cheap.
Do you like taking sunset walks on the beach?
Yes.
What was the last book you read?
The 7 Rules of Power.
What's the last movie or show you watched?
Shogun.
What is your go-to for downtime?
YouTube Shorts, sadly.
What would you eat for your last meal?
Sushi.
What did you eat for dinner last night?
Tofu and chicken.
What's something you did as a kid that you no longer do anymore, but wish you could?
Oh, play video games all day.
All right. So those are the fun questions.
Okay.
I'm still looking for the password to your bank account. We'll have to come back to that later. Okay. I want to shift gears a little bit and move into kind of entrepreneur focused questions. So this is what I anticipate entrepreneurs would love to learn more about your experience. So which entrepreneur do you look up to most and why? And what did that entrepreneur teach you?
I'm going to go OG with this. I still think Bill Gates is one of the best entrepreneurs of all time. That might be less popular to say these days, but I think that we talked a little bit about founder mode. Founder mode, I think Bill Gates is the original founder mode, right? He took a lot of flack back in the 80s and 90s for being so deep in the weeds with his team, but it was his superpower to go incredibly deep and nuance on any detail, and people would spend months preparing for their meeting for Bill Gates, and he would call it the Bill G meetings, and people would literally, their careers could either be made or they could be fired in that meeting. And I think his ability to understand every single part about his business, whether it's the technical side, the sales side, the marketing side, the partnership side, he just understood every aspect of his business. And he had a very strong opinion of how to build Microsoft at all times. And I think that type of founder and that MO that he established at a time where people's leadership generally was, I'm going to go hire a world-class head of whatever, and I'm going to help clear all their roadblocks and get out of their way. He had the opposite way of operating, which was get into the details, always never assume that person knew everything about their role, but I'm going to make sure that person is competent by asking incredibly detailed questions and making sure that person knows every aspect of their job was something that I think was just incredible. Incredible that he established that for the first time.
You actually received the Bill and Melinda Gates Scholarship. So was that in any way influenced your decision to?
I think he's an incredible person. I think I was incredibly lucky that I was part of the inaugural class for his scholarship, which paid for, I grew up with very humble, modest background, and I really needed that scholarship. And it paid, gave me a full ride for a public institution, which is great. The other thing that I think he's done is he's become one of the first sort of world-class philanthropists. And not only taking the Carnegie model that established the first nonprofits, and really with what he's done, and there's of course he's taken rightfully some criticism for some of the things that they've done or haven't done, but I think in general his mode of operating, which is to really ask the nonprofits for when he's giving his time and his money to an organization, he's asking incredibly detailed questions and making sure that there's commitment to deliver impact. And I think that's an incredible way to bring good to the world as well.
Yeah. What characteristics do you think make a great entrepreneur?
I think the characteristic bar none is grit. It's just incredibly hard to do anything of value in the world, that's on the sort of innovative edge of doing it, right? By definition, if it hasn't been done before, it's just not going to be easy to do it. There's many, many, many reasons why it hasn't been done before. Yeah. And so it's just easy to throw stones at what an entrepreneur is doing and saying, well, you're failing because of X, Y, Z. And so every entrepreneur will go through this period of time where things aren't working and it looks very dark. And unless you have an enormous amount of grit to get through those times and persevere when your family, your friends, when others in the industry are not, what you're doing is not working, it's, you're going to fail as an entrepreneur.
I guess, what is the trade-off between luck versus hard work for an entrepreneur achieving financial success?
Well, I think it's equal parts both. There has to be grit, there has to be a ton of hard work. But at the end of the day, a market either works out or it doesn't. And some of those things are beyond your control as an entrepreneur. And so, some businesses are incredibly sensitive to interest rates, for example. Those are very much out of your control, as an entrepreneur. And so, if you're in a capital intensive business and interest rates are low, your business is doing pretty well. And that's just not in your control. And, and then there's lots of things that affect every single startup. And so I do think that one of the mental health things that every entrepreneur that I try to really internalize, is that even if I've tried everything I possibly can, and things aren't going well, that there's a part of me that just says, I've given it my all. Can I look at myself honestly in a mirror and know that I've given it my all, and then also be okay that there's just things that were outside of my control that happened that made something not successful, and that's just part of life. And I think that it's a very healthy thing for people to be able to, that type of coping mechanism is really healthy for people to develop, because it's going to happen. Every entrepreneur over a long enough time period is going to face some huge setback. And being mentally resilient to bounce back from that is probably the biggest skill of all.
If you have to give one piece of advice to a new budding first-time entrepreneur, what advice would that be?
I would say it's the thing the advice would be, go find a mentor that's been through the entire gauntlet before. Because somebody who has been an entrepreneur before and had some type of exit, it doesn't necessarily have to be an amazing exit. In fact, it might be better to find a mentor who had kind of an okay, exit. And because that type of mentor will be so number one, those types of people, when you see an entrepreneur that's going through what you're going through for the first time and is earnestly looking for help and wants your advice and is willing to spend the time and energy to learn and work with you, mentors love that. And so, and I think that, somebody who's been through it before wants to mentor, somebody going through it for the first time.
Yeah.
And I think there's nothing better as an entrepreneur than to go find that mentor for you.
Who was your mentor?
My mentor was a man named Mike Brown, who was the CEO he later became the CEO of Symantec after I worked with him. But before that, he was the CEO of Quantum, which for most people might not remember. Yeah, it's a
hard drive company.
One of the early hard drive manufacturers, which was an incredibly difficult business.
Yeah.
And so he would relay all of the incredibly hard times that he had to go through at Quantum, the layoffs, the restructurings, the new business lines that he had to evolve to, and just kind of hearing his stories about how hard it was incredibly helpful. And of course, he would sit down and want to learn with me what my challenges were and then help me through those challenges. And it was a great relationship. And I attribute quite a bit of my success to his mentorship.
You founded a tech company, but you don't have a technical background.
Yes.
Do you think that is critically important in today's world, to have a founder with a technical background?
It depends on what kind of company it is. So I think for, let's call it a consumer, facing company, it is not important to have a technical background. And that's kind of more my area of expertise.
Yep.
Although I've done some developer tooling companies now. But I think for a consumer-facing company, you're generally, while you're on the bleeding edge of using technology and delivering a product or service to a consumer that hopefully is different than what's come before, I think increasingly these days, it's not important to have a technical background. Now there's I just learned of this new term now. It's called vibe coding, right? It's basically when you're using an AI tool that can basically not just mock up an entire app, but actually can put that into a development environment or production environment and actually run that code. You can basically mock up and like an individual with zero technical background can use AI tools to create an early prototype of a product, right? Of a software product. And these days, I think even as you look at hardware products that are mixed with software products, even that is increasingly becoming less technically challenging than it was, let's say, 10 years ago or certainly 20 years ago. And I think, so consumer-facing things is one good example of the idea, the narrative, the distribution channels, hitting a nerve with the right consumer segment is really important. I think, of course, if you're on the infrastructure side, you got to be incredibly technical.
Yeah.
You're just not going to build great infrastructure unless you're technical. So I think I'm not going to cover all the different things, but I think an entrepreneur has to really think, what sector are they going after, and how important is it to be deeply technical as you found a company in that sector.
Yeah. I'm really curious from an operator point of view, if you were talking to the VC world out there, how in general they could be better, more value added board members, what would that piece of advice be?
Yeah, look, I think,
and it can't be like, shut the hell up.
yeah, I think the first bar, which is a low bar, but an important one, I think, is just follow up on your commitments. There's so many times that a CEO, an entrepreneur is looking for help on X, Y, Z, and I think a VC, a board member will say, "Oh, let me dig around and help you with that," and then the CEO has to go figure out how to follow up on that, and ultimately, then maybe they discover that the VC hasn't actually done anything, in terms of the thing that they volunteered that they would go do. So I think one is just there's a bar of a lot of investors are great at pontificating, are great, very, very smart, but just lack the follow through. And so I think just being an investor that delivers on your follow through is a great first, step. I think the second thing is, I won't say it's any particularly one thing, but the best VCs are the ones where the entrepreneur thinks about making that first phone call when they have the issue, right? So how do you develop a relationship with that CEO or entrepreneur where you become that first phone call when there's an issue? I think that's when you know that you are adding a lot of value to that CEO, right? And I'll look at it from the other side, which is why would you want to do that as an investor? Well, because so many of the hard deals that you're trying to win really require your CEOs that you've invested in to kind of go to bat for you, right? So generally, a lot of entrepreneurs that have been around for a while, you find yourself in a seat where things are just going really well, and you go fundraise, and you've got hopefully 5, or I think the most term sheets I've ever got in a fundraise was 9, term sheets, something like that.
Stop showing off.
I've also taken 9 months, to get, one term sheet, right? So these cycles just happen, right? But when you're in that scenario and you've got your choice of investors to pick, every CEO is going to say, you know what? I've got a bunch of good names, that are interested in being a part of this. Let me go call up some of their portfolio companies. Or let me go take a look at who they backed, and let me make a phone call to somebody who knows this person, right? And if that CEO just raves about how amazing you are as an investor, you are much more likely to win that deal, because the reality is very few VCs are that first phone call that an entrepreneur would want to make.
Sure. Thanks for doing some of those reference calls for me, Paul, and on behalf of Conductive.
Yes. And I feel like you've won those deals that I've
We have. I think we're 100%. We're batting 1,000 right now. So I appreciate that. I'm curious, when you look at good board meetings versus bad board meetings, from a board member perspective, I feel like some of the worst board meetings are the ones where it's just completely varnished. The presentation is just way too slick. There are no problems in the company. How do you, as an entrepreneur, be transparent, but not also feel like you're going to be judged, or maybe how do you prevent having that hesitation to even show sort of the ugly truth of what's going on? and not feel beaten down?
Yeah, well, I think in the entrepreneur journey, you've got the fundraise and then you've got the board meetings, right? Those are the times where you spend a lot of time with investors. And they're very different mindsets, right? The reality is a VC, if you go into a VC pitch while you're raising money and you talk about the challenges, in your business, and it's that unvarnished, pitch that you have, you're not going to get funding done, right? that pitch needs to be all of the highlights, all of the great things that are happening with your business, right? And so that's very necessary for a fundraise, and that's just how the game works. On the other side, once you get that fundraise done and now you're in that board meeting with your chosen investors, now it's a very different side that needs to come out. And I think that's, again, where early entrepreneurs don't know how to make that transition, right? They stay in this fundraise mode. Oh, like the last time I talked to Carrie, or the last time I talked to this investor, I was in full pitch mode and to get this deal over the finish line. Well, let me continue that mentality into my board meeting. And that's not the right mentality. So I think for an entrepreneur in that board meeting, it is really starting to shift into a very different mode of operating that is much more like how one would interact with your direct reports, right? It's a professional relationship. Some people try to make it more like family or something, which is also a very not a great place to go. But what you're trying to do is, I'm trying to give you an honest version of what's going on, which includes all of the good things that we're working hard towards, but also here's, in reality, the challenges that we're facing, right?
Yeah.
And there are some challenges that you actually don't want to bring up, right? Some challenges are things that, frankly, are just what the CEO or the executive team needs to just deal with, right? Like, oh, I'm fighting with a co-founder. Well, I mean, yes, you could bring that up in a board meeting if it's really getting to the worst thing ever.
Yeah.
But there's going to be things that a CEO deals with that probably shouldn't be the things that you talk about at the board level. They should be strategic things that are going to affect the business. And maybe the relationships with certain people are affecting the business, and then you need to bring it up in a board meeting. But I do think that every company should talk about, these are the deals that we're losing. Here's why we're losing those deals. That's like a great example of a really candid look at what's happening with the business that starts to drive strategic discussions. And I think, again, a great board member will be able to help an executive team, can help the CEO see around the corners and say, look, I've got these 10 other software companies that are selling, and here's why they're losing deals. Here's what they did to take those learnings and figure out what to do about them. And that becomes a great discussion to have with the board. And so I do think it is making that mentality switch from full fundraise mode to board member, in board meeting mode, that a CEO just needs to develop both of those skills.
You live in Silicon Valley, so do I. There are the good parts of Silicon Valley, which is an amazing place with incredible talent. But there's also kind of the negative side, which is being in the bubble of Silicon Valley. As a founder, how do you keep your true north, stay independent, but not get influenced by the hype of Silicon Valley?
I get off Twitter. I still use social media, of course, and social media is helpful for promoting the business and building a reputation, out there. That's just the reality of where we are in 2025. But I do think a lot of CEOs, first-time entrepreneurs, and even, there's great ways to use, social media to really promote your business. And then I feel like sometimes people go overboard and they let that consume their life. And the reality is you could spend an unlimited amount of time on social media trying to build engagement and create followers and engage with those followers. It's just not healthy mentally, to be spending all of your time, doing that. And so I do think, part of the bubble is saying, there's things that I don't need to do to keep up with, the other entrepreneurs that are around the Valley. And for me, that's saying, social media, that's just one of the things that I'm going to be there. I'm going to have some sort of a presence, but I'm not going to be spending an inordinate amount of time there.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that my advice used to be 10 or 20 years ago, that you could also spend all of your time going to a cocktail party or to some VC like dinner and meetup and like something where a bunch of other entrepreneurs in your industry are at. And especially here in the Valley, you could literally go to one of those every night of the week.
Yeah.
And so I think that generally is not helpful. Maybe at a certain stage in your company, maybe you're trying to meet a co-founder or something at the very earlier stages, that might be helpful. But if you've got money, if you've got your capital raised and you've got your team built, there's other things that you could probably be doing with your time. So it's really just learning, I think, as a CEO, where are you investing your time? Why are you doing it? And just having a critical eye again, and not assuming that the way that this other CEO that I met last week, the way that they're doing it is the way that I absolutely have to do it. But I think just thinking critically about where am I spending time? What am I trying to accomplish? How am I trying to accomplish that in the most impactful way that I think serves a CEO well?
When you look back on your journey, do you think being Asian American as a founder and CEO impacted you negatively or positively when you think about fundraising, when you think about managing? Do you ever feel like you were at a loss?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, let me talk about the positives first. I think on the positive side, I do think that the stereotypes around an Asian, an Asian male, I'll say, has been, oh, this person's smart. This person probably put their heads down and they really understand.
Probably good at math.
They're probably good at math.
Which, by the way, you are good at math. So, yeah.
They're probably good at math. They're probably, they understand the technical aspect. I don't have to assume this person's probably, reasonably technical. I don't have to worry that they're just selling vaporware, at the end of the day. So that's the positive aspect of that. That's of being an Asian American. So I do think there's a strong halo associated with that.
Okay.
I think on the negative side, there's immediately a red flag around can this person build a team? Can this person be a great, strong, leader? Can this person sell? Can this person build relationships with other businesses and organizations and that they need to build a relationship with, right? And so I think all of those things, tend to be the things that, while I don't think anybody would say that they're, I think those things tend to be harder. I will say 20 years ago when I first started, I think these were like 7 or 8 out of 10 in terms of challenges for an entrepreneur. And I don't want to diminish it. I think in 2025, first time, Asian founders still have some of those challenges, but now you have at the very pinnacle now, you've got Jensen Huang, right? You've got Eric, Yuan of Zoom. You've got a few others now that have, kind of set this precedent that you can be an incredibly successful, especially technology CEO, these days as an Asian American. And so I think it's less of an issue than it used to be, but I would still say it's, there's probably some yellow flags that people will still, in the back of their heads, want to, you start to fight against some of those stereotypes.
Yeah. All right, we're going to transition into Kevin perspective questions. Okay. May or may not have anything to do with being an entrepreneur. Do you think success has changed you?
Yes.
How?
The reality, one of the things I had a lot of imposter syndrome around was you knew me back when I was, in college, right?
Oh, yeah.
People would not say that I was a confident person. And I think that was, and it was something that I knew about myself that I always wanted to change. I wanted to be more confident. And, I think I would say that that's probably been the biggest positive change for myself is that I've gone through these hard times. I've come out the other end. And I just have a lot more confidence, in myself, these days. And I think that's been probably the biggest benefit of having some success.
Are there any negatives to the success?
Yes. I think, I grew up with pretty modest background,
Yeah.
and I used to always pride myself in finding a good deal and, and being sort of conductive about frugal,
Smart cheap. Frugal is smart cheap. Yep.
frugally minded about things. And, sometimes I do feel a little sheepish of like, oh, yeah, I'm willing, I spend a bunch of money on this or that, and I, might not have really needed that thing. And, you know, and then I go through this weird mental process of, well, but I can afford it. But, oh, was that really the smartest thing? Maybe I should have spent a little bit more time. Well, my time's very valuable. Like, maybe I shouldn't, like, this is fine. I've got enough money to not worry about this. So I kind of go through those little mental gymnastics still. And it's one of the things that I think I'm sort of still torn between, I still want to get that good deal, but I don't necessarily want to invest the time anymore to do it. And so that's I go through that like little bit of negative, like where the world was more simple for me earlier. I didn't have the money. Of course, I'm going to go figure out how to
Get the best deal.
Get the best deal I can for it.
Interesting. Okay. How do you think AI will change our world in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
I think all of the hype is probably not enough still around AI. I think AI will so dramatically change our world that in 20 years it will not be recognizable from what it is today.
Have you ever felt this way about any other technology shift with mobile, with cloud?
Yes, but not to this extent.
This is by far the most transformative.
This is by far the most transformative. I would say that I was one of the early people to get on the internet. I was on the internet before I was using, Pine for, as an email, client, and I was doing IRC chats.
How fast was your first modem?
It's 2,400 baht,
Okay.
just for those.
There we go.
Just for as a reality check. But I just think, when I first got on the internet, I said, wow, this is going to change the world. Right? And I just like this idea that I could be sitting 1,000 miles away from somebody and having a conversation with them in real time and sharing, a file, playing a game, with them. I was like, wow, this is mind blowing. This is going to change the world. And it has, and it's certainly a layer of infrastructure. Obviously, AI couldn't be built the way it is without having the internet, already as mature as it is. But I think AI reaches another level, which is, it's clear to me that whether we've hit AGI in this part of 2025 or not, we're going to get, in AGI, I think there's sort of different levels, to it, but I think we're certainly going to get to a point where you could take certainly any white collar profession.
Yep.
You could take a very good lawyer, not necessarily the best lawyer, but like, let's say a very good lawyer. You could take a very good accountant. You could take a very good software developer. And that job is going to be done by AI. Like, an AI will do that job better than most very good people at that job. And unlike a human, which has organic limits to their capabilities, an AI doesn't. The scale of it will be unbelievable. And so not only will it get better, it will keep getting better at a rate that is hard for, I think, humans have never been good at understanding exponential growth.
Sure.
And so I think this exponential growth of how good AI will get over the next 20 years, we can't even imagine. But I look at just the last 2 years since the original ChatGPT came out to where it is in February of 2025, the amount of improvement has been
Exponential. I agree.
And we're only 2 years in.
So what do you and your wife think about in terms of jobs of the future and what your kids should be studying? Your kids are still really young, but.
Yes. Yeah, look, I think my wife is, in a technology startup as well. She's in mental health. we talk about this quite a bit. So I think there's going to be a de-emphasis, I think, in STEM skills, which I will say, I love math. I'm very passionate about teaching my kids about math,
I know.
as you know.
I've seen it. I've seen it.
I actually think the computational part of math is going to be a lot less important. This idea that you're going to do this worksheet, that you're going to do like math problems 100 different times to make sure you know every variation of the multiplication table, that's probably just not going to be as important anymore. The problem solving part of math will probably still be relevant in some ways, even though AI can do problem solving incredibly well. I think more controversial one is we don't teach our kids, we took our kids out of immersion school and we don't emphasize speaking Chinese anymore. It's probably controversial because part of us, I can imagine a world 20 years from now when they become adults and they're going to China, they're going to other countries in the world. In 20 years, nobody will learn different languages anymore because the AI will be so good. I think already in 2025, and this was even true in 2023, AI could translate. Translation was one of the first things that AI got really good at. Right. And now we have, we're wearing earbuds all the time. You got your phone certainly with you. Now you're wearing, smart glasses that can also do things too.
Like the UN with the live translation, instead of with humans, now you have.
So this idea that you could go to any country in the world and you can have a conversation with anybody in the world who speaks whatever language they're going to speak, and you're going to have the compute power and the devices to automatically translate that for you. And so while yes, there'll still be, you can just like you can learn Latin these days and you could do things that, because you really appreciate the thing. I think, this idea that you're going to want to speak a different language is going to be, by and large for the large majority of people, is going to be something that we use technology to do.
Right.
And that there's still going to be people who really love languages and want to learn them, and that's going to happen, of course. But by and large, we're going to use technology to do translations for us, right? So that's a more controversial one, but I'll put it out there as kind of my perspective on that.
Okay.
And then I think a more easy one is, I do think in the world of AI, things like your communication skills, your leadership skills, charisma, and your ability to do something compelling for other human beings that AI cannot do, like those are going to be the things that I think become elevated in their importance.
So when you think about when we were young analysts in investment banking, I imagine that AI today could do our jobs 20 plus years ago much better than we could do it.
Oh, absolutely.
So how do you train more senior people in the future when the junior folks don't get the types of learning that they would historically get because AI is so good?
Well, I think a great junior employee now is on the bleeding edge of using AI at its most efficient way to do a job. So I think the junior jobs, and the reality is there's just going to be, there's going to be less of them, right? Which is, you and I were the army of other analysts because combing through
10 Qs and 10 Ks
and 10 Ks would take, a few hours to find all the information you need. Now you could just, ask an AI tool, like upload the document, and the AI tool will figure it out within a few seconds, and pull exactly the information that you need. I think it's going to change where there's going to be a shift, I think in general, where junior people need, the way that you become a great junior employee and have that accelerated career is that you're at the forefront of using these AI tools to do your job in a way that is, 2x, 3x, 10x more efficiently than before.
If you had the opportunity to go back in time and talk to 10-year-old Kevin Chou, what would you tell him?
10-year-old?
10-year-old Kevin Chou, fifth grader.
I would just say it's all going to turn out fine. I think I had a huge chip on my shoulder at 10 years old. Maybe not that young, but probably that young. And the reality is that chip on my shoulder of wanting to be successful, wanting to make my mark, growing up without a whole lot of financial resources, I think that gave me a huge chip on my shoulder. but it wasn't fun to have a big chip on my shoulder. I do think so I'm learning, like a lot of what I'm trying to do now is say, the weapons that I bring into the arena as an entrepreneur are really different than when I was 26 years old and starting Water Cooler. And one of, I think, the advantages I had as a 26-year-old was I had a huge chip on my shoulder. At 40, at 45 with 3 young kids and 5 startups, like the things that are going to make my startup successful now, the skills and the weapons that I bring into that arena just have to be different, and should be different than when I was 26. And I think I'm trying to figure that out. But I think to my 10-year-old self, as a personal thing, I certainly would have, I think, enjoyed my childhood more if I wasn't so angsty and so competitive all the time.
Did you know that you wanted to be an entrepreneur at 10?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right. How do you define happiness, and do you feel like you've found it?
Yes, I do feel like I found it. I think happiness is really taking every moment of life, not every moment, but a lot of moments in life, and just being fully present and focusing on the positives of exactly what's happening at that moment. And I will, I will say that the biggest, having a family and, bringing up young kids, I think has been the best thing in my life, because it's a lot easier to focus on these moments, because, kids grow up so fast, and it's so easy to say, I want to really enjoy this moment with my family right now. And that's all there is in this world right now, in this moment, is this experience with my family, or whatever I'm doing. And that's brought me a lot of happiness in my life.
What does legacy mean to you? How do you hope people will remember your work?
My thinking about this has changed over the years. I used to think, I'm going to build a company that's going to be so impactful that people will remember it forever. Or maybe not forever, but at least for a few decades. In the reality, I think for 99.99% of startups, even if you're successful, you probably won't be remembered 10 years from now, certainly 20 years from now, right? Yes, maybe you could say the OpenAIs and a few others, but you can take these incredibly successful companies from the 90s, 2000s, the unicorns, that exited back then.
Yep.
I bet even most VCs won't be able to name 90% or 99% of those, exited unicorns, even though they were incredibly impactful for their time, right? So I think one of the good things about technology startups and what we face in the Valley is that things are changing all the time. And that means there's an opportunity to build something new and incredible and be a part of this next cycle or wave of innovation. But it also means that in this world of AI, nobody remembers what the cloud computing innovators were doing, 15 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And so, so I think, again, it's sort of not worrying about legacy, so much. It's just like, is an entrepreneur enjoying what they're doing right now? And that could be all sorts of reasons for starting a company. It could be the love of the technology, the product, the service, whatever it is. It could be the love of building something new. It could be because they're competitive. It could be all sorts of different things. But I think legacy more and more is at a smaller level, which is, did I make a positive impact on the people that I hired and managed? Did I help them learn new skills? Did they go off and have a more successful career because they worked, with me or for me? Was I able to help somebody buy a new house because, or their first house because they had equity in my company? And I have I have this label in my Gmail folder right now that's basically just thank you letters, And I saved them because those are some of the things that I love the most as I read these emails of like somebody who was able to buy their first house, somebody that said, because of what they learned, working with me or at a company that I started, that they went off and had this incredible career somewhere else. And those are really meaningful to me. And I think that is those are the things 20 years from now, I hope that person will remember that experience that they had with me and and think really positively on that experience. And I think that's an incredible legacy versus 20 years from now. I don't know if somebody will remember what Kabam did, as a company.
Before I let you go, and you've been incredibly generous with your time, I promised everyone that we were going to get back to this professional poker detour that you took. Can you tell folks, because it doesn't show up on your LinkedIn and most people will never really ever hear about it, but there was a time that I remember very clearly that you decided to go play professional poker. So tell everyone about that, why you decided to do it, why you decided to try it.
Well, you remember this, Kerry. We were living together.
Yeah.
And another thing we didn't talk about was that I was laid off from my investment banking job.
Yep.
And it was like my dream job coming out of college was to go into investment banking. I think I was the one who persuaded you to go into investment
100%.
banking.
100%.
And so, I felt kind of lost, in my career. I was like, I don't want to try to get another investment banking job. I know that. I actually did not like what I did day to day, as an investment banker.
I remember that. I thought it was so funny because you're the one who helped me get into investment banking, and I think I liked it more than you did.
That's right. And so, I knew I wanted to have a change in career somehow.
Yeah.
At that point in time, and but I didn't know what it was, and so I said, I'm good with math, I'm good with numbers, and I like uncertainty, actually. And so I was like, I think I could go to the poker tables. And, I always seemed to, whenever I played poker prior to that, I always seemed like, I did pretty well and would win some money. Let me see if I could make a living off of this. And, I made enough money over about 6 months to pay the rent and pay for food and stuff. And
probably my biggest concern, that you wouldn't make rent.
That I wouldn't make rent?
Yeah, that was my biggest concern.
But I think it's an incredible skill set. And it's, I think David Sachs runs like he's part of
high roller
poker that's pretty famous around the valley and so forth. So there's a lot of entrepreneurs, there's a lot of VCs who think like the skills of playing poker. I don't have all the information. I need to make decisions. I need to commit. Understanding statistics. All of these are incredibly important skills. And then, of course, how to bluff, how to semi-bluff, how do my actions change the actions of those sitting around the table? Those are all incredibly important skills to learn, and I really enjoyed that. But I also figured out after 6 months that if I just kept doing this for another 6 years, that I wouldn't actually learn that much more. And so after about 6 months of playing poker, I said, it's time for me to move on.
Or were you afraid that you'd become a degenerate gambler?
Probably that too.
All right, I want to thank Kevin for, again, spending some time with us. This has been another episode of Conductive Conversations. Please join us next time for our next episode.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
10 years ago, I would say most parents would have tried to put their middle school or maybe middle school / high school age kids into some sort of coding camp or class or something.
Yep.
I would say by and large, everyone agrees. My view of that is that that's useless. This idea that you're going to be learning this like how to do code, when you're 10 years old at this point, totally useless.
Did you actually push record? Was that the technical difficulty? All right. Okay. We'll start it over again. But then Kevin knows all my jokes now that I even wrote in. Darn.
I'll laugh still.
The second time will be better.